Coming up, the odds of a shockingly large Republican victory, including President Trump winning an even larger electoral margin than in 2016, have actually increased. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk for a moment about the tea leaves. What do I see coming politically? Well, I've said before that what's happening with the pandemic and the shutdowns and the overwhelming increase in unemployment and a potential wave of business and personal bankruptcies, that it's so overwhelming, so extraordinary, that it makes it extremely difficult to figure out what that impact will be. As I look back over the last 20 years or so of politics as practiced by the Democrat Party, I see overreach being practiced as the norm. I see an absurd degree of attention paid to the fringes of the party, to the point that the Democrat Party fringes have become the core. Now, if you listen to the media, to the extent they even acknowledge in part what has happened with the Democrat Party, they contend that it's happened with Republicans as well. But I demonstrated in this podcast before, and in an article I wrote on HollywoodInToto.com about why I started this podcast, that Pew Research did a study of the changing positions of the Democrat and Republican parties from 1994 to 2017, and their findings were startling. The midpoint of the conservative versus liberal scale for the Republican Party moved only slightly to the right during that 13-year period. But the midpoint for the Democrat Party moved roughly 9 times as far to the left during that period. Based on the party's publicly espoused positions, the Democrats have become much more extreme since the 1990s than the Republicans. Notwithstanding all of the protestations to the contrary from the news media, celebrities, academia, and the Democrat Party operatives themselves, assuming for a moment that much of the news media and Democrat operatives are not actually the same people. So why do I bring that up in the context of talking about where I think things are going to go politically in the wake of this pandemic and the lockdowns? Because I think the Democrat response is another example of overreach, of overreaction, of pushing things to the fringes so that the fringe becomes the norm within the party. A friend of mine who's quite liberal said to me recently that President Trump was going to lose in a tidal wave because the voters are going to be upset about the massive rise in unemployment, the potential loss of everything they've gained financially, and the coming wave of business closures. He said that people would vote their pocketbooks. I think that's an analysis that works in ordinary times. But the question I asked him in response was, who are they going to blame? This isn't a typical economic downturn, and I don't just say that because it's severe. This is a pandemic in which the reaction was to essentially quarantine everybody rather than quarantine the infected and protect the vulnerable. It was a pandemic at least exacerbated by the government of a country, China. That country's misinformation and cover-up, by some calculations, resulted in up to 95% of the spread of the virus. As I've said before, anybody who disputes that China's conduct was inexcusable must confront the fact that China shut down air travel from Wuhan to the rest of China when this started, but allowed air travel from Wuhan out of China. Nothing more need to be provided to understand just how bad China is as a world actor. So with those circumstances, which are unusual to say the least, who are the voters going to blame? Well, unless you're just a die-hard anti-Trumper, the kind of person whose teeth are already clenched in anticipation of hearing the latest on Trump's tweets for the day from the crew on Morning Joe as you walk across the house towards breakfast, it's pretty hard to blame the president for a virus. But it really wasn't a virus that caused the economic effects. That was the action, and the effects were going to be severe, but it was the reaction, the closing down of all non-essential businesses and travel and medical procedures, which caused the incredibly severe impact. Now, we could be arguing about whether the reaction was a mistake, and frankly, other than perhaps a couple of weeks of severe restrictions, I suspect that it was. Hindsight being 2020, I suspect the better reaction would have been to focus on the New York City metro area once it became a hotspot, and everywhere else simply focus on protecting the most vulnerable populations, nursing homes being the most obvious example, shutting down massive public events and encouraging the use of some social distancing and face masks. And if the Democrat Party and their propaganda arm in the media had conducted an actual debate on those questions, if the media had actually engaged in journalism, and if the Democrat Party didn't have such an alarming affinity for authoritarianism, there might have been a divide on the left that could have been used to attack President Trump. If some members of the Democratic leadership had been saying the shutdowns are going too far, if some had been saying, hold on, there are all sorts of products sold at Walmart that you can buy in smaller independent stores, there's no reason that those stores should have to shut down. If they sell T-shirts or jewelry, for example, just tell them they have to restrict the number of customers in the store, or the customers have to cover their faces, or both. But that isn't what happened. The Democratic Party and the left uniformly took a position in favor of shutdown. The most conciliatory they would be is to say that Trump's position focusing on essential businesses was appropriate, but that he didn't act fast enough. But even more members of Democrat leadership, including multiple Democratic governors around the country, took the position that President Trump hadn't gone far enough. Seeming dictators in training like Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan launched into hyper-specific micromanagement of precisely what items businesses could sell, and then, after the pandemic effects have started to wane and the overwhelming adverse effects of the shutdown have become apparent, far too many of these Democratic governors seem virtually incapable of giving up their newfound power to control every aspect of our daily lives. In short, the Democratic Party now owns the shutdown. President Trump correctly recognized the separation of powers between the federal government and the states, and the Democratic Party ran with it. So who are the voters going to blame? Well, the Democrats missed their chance to control that. If they had been divided, they would have maintained flexibility. They could have shifted slightly and used their propaganda arm in the mainstream media. They could have pointed at President Trump to make the shutdown his. But now, and for several weeks, he's been the one pushing to open up. It's the Democrats who've been pushing back. They are the party of the shutdown. They are the party of overreaction. They are the party of fear. They are the party most connected with what looks like something approaching a desire to destroy the economy. And President Trump looks like a president who wants to bring it back. And with each new day showing Democratic governors or mayors extending their emergency powers and slow-rolling reopening and pushing law enforcement to crack down on people who resist, the answer becomes more obvious. The voters are going to blame the Democrats. The Democrats own the shutdown. The Democrats own the business bankruptcies. The Democrats own the massive increase in unemployment. And the Democrats own the authoritarian tendencies that have been on display now for weeks. I can't guarantee what will happen, of course, but what I'm seeing is a roadmap for electoral success for President Trump and the Republican Party. If I had to predict, I'd say it'll be close. But the odds of a backlash, the odds of a shockingly large Republican victory, including President Trump winning an even larger electoral margin than in 2016, have actually increased. It's virtually undeniable that the level of enthusiasm of the Republican base is higher than the level of enthusiasm of the Democratic base. It's hard to believe that all of the Bernie Sanders supporters are going to show up and vote for Joe Biden. If in addition to those two factors, independents vote for Donald Trump by large margins, his electoral victory will be huge. Is there anything more? Is there anything I've missed? Well, one more thing. It'll sound like a digression, but it's not. Back during the 2016 election, some analysts pointed out that the Solicitor General in the Obama administration, acknowledging before the Supreme Court that the administration could take away the tax exemption of church institutions which fail to recognize gay marriage, terrified huge numbers of the religious community in the U.S. Evangelicals were almost certainly going to vote for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton anyways, but it may have driven more of them to the polls. But what that exchange in the Supreme Court may have done was mobilize Catholics who were on the fence to vote for Donald Trump. And that issue, that exchange between a U.S. Supreme Court justice and a lawyer in the Obama administration may have by itself been enough to represent the entire margin of victory of Donald Trump in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Think about that. The margins were that small, and the number of Catholics in those states is that large. So why do I bring that up? Because of what's happening right now with the shutdown across the country. The refusal of large numbers, huge numbers of politicians, almost exclusively Democrat politicians, to recognize the essential nature of religion to the population. I've said before that the Democrat model for good governance seems to be an out-of-control condo board. Essentially, little politicians sitting in control of their building, their fiefdom, saying that, well, I don't need a pickup truck, you don't need a pickup truck, I don't see a reason for anybody to have a pickup truck because I don't need one. So let's ban pickup trucks in our condo. Well, that's the way far too many Democrat politicians are approaching this shutdown. They're categorizing liquor stores as essential services and churches as not because they see the value of liquor stores and they don't see the value of churches. Every politician, whether religious or not, should recognize the value of religion to Americans. The very founding of this country is based on a recognition of the value of the freedom to practice the religion of your choice. Large numbers of the political class now don't recognize that historical underpinning, and they don't recognize or they don't care what it means to huge numbers of the populace. And virtually every one of those members of the political class is a Democrat. So not only do the Democrats own the shutdown of the economy, but they also own the shutdown of churches, the shutdown of practicing your religion. Think about the backlash to that exchange in the Supreme Court regarding the potential to simply take away the tax exemption for churches. Now think about politicians actually shutting churches down. The potential cost to the Democratic Party of this overreach on the practice of religion is enormous. Think about not just Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, but think about Virginia. President Trump was always going to win downstate Virginia, but the religious practice issue, as well as some other ones that I might talk about next week, can drive voter turnout in Virginia outside of the D.C. metro area to unprecedented levels. There's a lot of time between now and the election, and I hope our economy comes roaring back. But even if it doesn't, even if the growth is far too slow for my tastes and everyone's economic needs, there's reason to believe that the president and the rest of the Republican Party are looking at a major victory on Election Day. Next topic. Memorial volunteers. Let's transition from politics for a few minutes. Monday, May 25, 2020, is Memorial Day, the day set aside to honor the men and women who died serving their country in the U.S. military. We're a big country with nearly 244 years of history. That's not a lot of history on the timeline of world history, but for a democracy, in our case a constitutional republic, that's a long time. And that history has been marked by bravery, by those who made the ultimate sacrifice defending freedom, our way of life, and ensuring that America would become and remain a shining example of what can be achieved when we recognize the rights of people to determine how they'll live their lives, what they will do with the fruits of their labor, and who will sit in their government. Every American has been affected by or is connected to someone who gave their life in the U.S. military in service to America. It may be a family member, a close friend, or someone you never knew, but if you look, you'll find the connection. I'm going to mention 6 people, including one family friend, someone connected to the place of my birth, and 4 others forever linked to my alma mater. The family friend is Charles P. Claxton, the Vietnam veteran who gave his life on a top-secret mission so far into North Vietnam that it was almost in China. Charlie was a close friend of my father, and on December 29, 1967, then Major Charles Claxton was part of an Air Force Special Ops team in an electronics-laden EC-130, skirting the mountaintops and diving to the treetops and through the riverine canyons of Lê Chao province in extreme northwest North Vietnam, almost to the Chinese border. They dropped millions of psychological operations leaflets from high altitude for maximum disbursement in hopes some would reach Hanoi, and then conducted a rapid descent at breakneck speeds to release a notional drop. That's a drop comprised of materials designed to confuse the enemy and get them to expend resources pursuing something that doesn't exist, like, for example, a spy or an infiltrator on the ground. This was a top-secret, clandestine, extremely high-risk mission. The first drop was a success. The second never occurred. It took decades to determine what happened, then years more to identify the remains. The plane had crashed into a mountain. It crashed in remote North Vietnam, and Charlie Claxton was finally buried in Arlington National Cemetery 33 years later on November 15, 2000. For the full story of Charles Claxton and the top-secret mission on which he lost his life, check out episode 37 of this podcast entitled Lost in the Night. So who's the veteran who gave his life in service of the country who's connected to the place of my birth? I was born on Kinchlow Air Force Base in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The base was named after Ivan Carl Kinchlow, Jr., a U.S. Air Force fighter ace from the Korean War, who became a test pilot at that haven for test pilots so well depicted in the movie The Right Stuff, Edwards Air Force Base on the California-Nevada border. Kinchlow became part of the X-2 flight program, and through it was the first to ever fly above 100,000 feet. He gave his life at only 30 years of age in the crash of an F-104, the same type of aircraft Chuck Yeager crashed in The Right Stuff. Kinchlow was fighting in a war. It just wasn't a hot one. He died fighting the Cold War, and America and the rest of the world owes a debt of gratitude to him and his fellow soldiers, sailors, and airmen and women for all they did to make sure we prevailed in that war. And speaking of debts of gratitude, I can't go without mentioning the tremendous sacrifices of America's greatest generation in fighting World War II. And it is that war that took the lives of the remaining 4 servicemen I'll reference in this episode. I've mentioned in the podcast before that I'm a graduate of the University of Tennessee. Some people don't realize the background of the unusual nickname of the University of Tennessee sports teams, Volunteers. People understand why the University of West Virginia refers to its teams as Mountaineers, given it's a state that's so mountainous that if you flattened it out, it might be the size of Texas. And in the state where I now make my home, nobody needs much of an explanation to understand the nicknames Gators, Seminoles, and Hurricanes. So why Volunteers? Well, it comes from the state nickname, the Volunteer State. And where does that come from? It comes from the tradition of the citizens of the state of Tennessee to volunteer for military service. There are multiple episodes of Tennessee providing military volunteers in large numbers for fighting military conflicts, including the Battle of New Orleans under Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812, and 33 Tennessee volunteers were present at the Alamo, including most famously Davy Crockett, and the instance which most likely led to the state and then the university being given the nickname was also during the Mexican-American War. The Secretary of War under President James K. Polk put out an order seeking 2,600 volunteers to join the fight, and 30,000 Tennesseans joined. That's incredible. Tennessee, both the state and its university, is understandably proud of its history of volunteering for military service. And if you look past the relatively mediocre, to say the least, performance of the Tennessee football team over the last 6 to 8 years, they do have ample reason to be proud of the team as well. I certainly remember with fondness its peak performances in the 1990s, including the 1998 championship. But the real height of volunteer football came long ago, appropriately under a brigadier general, Coach Robert Neyland. He served in the Army in both World War I and II, and when he wasn't serving in the military, he was the Volunteers football coach, retiring as possibly the greatest defensive coach of all time for any team. 109 of his team's 173 wins came by way of shutouts. But Coach Neyland didn't die while serving in the Army. The last 4 persons I referenced were University of Tennessee football players, volunteers who died during World War II. Willis N. Tucker, Bill Nowling, Rudy Clarer, and Clyde Ig Fusen. All 4 gave their lives in the European theater of World War II. And the University of Tennessee retired their jersey numbers. They were all good football players, and Tucker was also a top-notch track star running the 220-yard low hurdles. By the way, to give you some idea of just how much football has changed since back then, Willis Tucker, who was a sprinter competing in the 220-yard low hurdles, played center on the football team. And it was one of the best football teams in the country. Can you imagine a center on a football team running track, the 220 hurdles now? The fact that the university retired their numbers, the fact that the university honored them by placing their names and jersey numbers in the Ring of Honor around the inside of the stadium, along with some of the greatest college athletes in football history, including Reggie White and Peyton Manning, is evidence of just how much military service means to the state of Tennessee. It's a football stadium, and college football is almost a religion in the South. But reverence for military service is even more prominent in the South, as it should be. And as we recognize Memorial Day, let's recognize how much it should mean to us all as we honor those who gave it all in service to America. I mentioned just a few of the thousands upon thousands who've given their lives to preserve our freedoms. Charles Claxton, Ivan Kinchlow Jr., Willis Tucker, Bill Nowling, Rudy Clarer, and Clyde Ig Fusen. Thank you for your service and your sacrifice. We owe you all and the rest of your brothers and sisters in the military a great debt of gratitude. And I owe you, listeners, another episode of Political Spirits. We'll be back next week. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.